Καλησπέρα σας, κυρίες και κύριοι. Καλησπέρα σας και καλώς ήρθατε στο Καναδικό Ινστιτούτο στην Ελλάδα για την ετήσια διάλεξη Πάρης Αρνόπουλος. Φέτος έχουμε την μεγάλη χαρά να έχουμε μαζί μας τρεις διεθνώς αναγνωρισμένους ακαδημαϊκούς από τα Πανεπιστήμια του Τορόντο, της Αθήνας και της Κρήτης και τους ευχαριστώ θερμά που αποδέχτηκαν την προσκλήση μας. Chers amis, toujours un plaisir de vous recevoir à l'Institut canadien, ici à Athènes. Et le plaisir est encore plus grand lorsqu'il s'agit de la conférence annuelle Paris Arnopoulos. Alors je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous le bienvenu. Nice to have you all here this evening with us for the 2026 Paris Arnopoulos Lecture. If you do an internet search on tyrants in modern history, you'll see that you'll get a very long list of names. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Augusto Pinochet, Kim Il-sung, Saddam Hussein, Francisco Franco, Ahmed Sékou Touré, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, Bashar al-Assad, just to name a few. More recently, Donald Trump has been called a tyrant on several occasions, just a few days ago during the No Kings protest movement. Benjamin Netanyahu, you are a tyrant who massacres Palestinian children, Turkish President Erdogan had said in response to Netanyahu calling him a dictator. Many political figures have called Vladimir Putin a tyrant. Putin is absolutely a tyrant. You give this guy an inch, he'll take over your country, declared the colorful Ontario Premier Doug Ford. In other cases, the use of the term is somewhat more surprising. Emmanuel Macron has been called a tyrant. Macron, tyran ou fasciste, headlined a French newspaper article. Pedro Sanchez, the decidedly left-wing Spanish prime minister, was sharply attacked by Elon Musk, who called him a tyrant and a traitor to the Spanish people. While in some cases journalists and political observers question whether a head of state is a dictator, a despot, or a tyrant, the fact remains that today the word tyrant is used indiscriminately. The Paris Arnopoulos 2026 conference offers an opportunity for historical and philosophical reflection on tyranny, thanks to the presence of three internationally renowned researchers. Dr. Ryan Balot, Professor of Political Science and Classics at the University of Toronto, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, specializing in classical political thought with a focus on Plato's laws, ancient Greek democracy, and the intersection of ethics and politics, will be speaking on an archaeology of tyranny, fear, ambition, and power. Dr. Balot's lecture will be followed by remarks from Dr. Chloe Bala, Professor of Ancient Philosophy at the Department of Philosophy, University of Crete, specializing on the Sophist, the Hippocratic Corpus, and Plato's Dialogues. She will be focusing on the idea of philosophical education as a prophylactic against tyranny. And from Dr. Lambrini Rory, Assistant Professor in Political Analysis at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. Dr. Rory will focus on whether fear alone can explain contemporary anti-democratic politics. A panel discussion will follow these talks. Before inviting Professor Balot to present us his lecture, let me first thank Paris Arnopoulos, Professor Emeritus at Concordia University in Montreal, for his generous donation that has enabled us to offer this annual lectures series. I now invite Professor Balot. Thank you.
Kalispera sas. Bonsoir. Good evening. Thank you very much, Professor Perreault, for that kind introduction. And I would like to thank, in addition to Professor Perreault, Dr. Jonathan Tomlinson and Ms. Zoe Delibasis for their invitation and their warm hospitality. No city provides a more appropriate setting for exploring this important topic than Athens, which has suffered through tyrannies, ancient and modern, and is the birthplace of both democracy and political philosophy. Today, indeed, I want to approach tyranny in a Socratic, that is, interrogative sense. No one is happier than I am to live in one of the world's leading liberal democracies, Canada, and to come today to the Canadian Institute of Greece. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, recently quoted Thucydides at Davos in order to highlight a legitimate concern about the imperial presidency and its impact on the international order. He quotes, the strong, he says, slightly misquoting, can do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must. We should never lose sight of the abuses of contemporary autocrats, such as Hitler and Stalin. Equally, recent attacks on liberal democracy from the far right and left shouldn't lead us to forget the moral and political advantages of liberal democracy. All the same, it's critical for us as democratic citizens and observers to avoid complacency. A dispassionate approach to tyranny, fueled by the ancient Greek classics, can help us to avoid oversimplification. And so tonight, in the birthplace of democracy, I want to raise questions that will, I hope, help us to think more clearly, not only about tyranny, but also about our own politics. So what is tyranny? Is tyranny unambiguously harmful? Or have writers approved of tyranny in certain circumstances? What are the central tyrannical passions? Eros, thumos, or spirit, fear, anger, or something else? In the Politics, Aristotle wrote that, I quote, tyranny is a government by a single person directed to the interests of that person as opposed to the common good. Instead of respecting free and equal citizenship, tyrants treat the citizenry as slaves. They rule contrary to the will of their subjects and disregard the law. Aristotle complicates that characterization, however, by pointing out that the early Greeks occasionally elected tyrants for a specific purpose. The Mitylenaeans, for example, elected Pittacus, tyrant, in order to defend the city against against exiles led by the poet Alcaeus. Tyrants can, as his example shows, be elected, rule by law, and govern willing subjects, even though Alcaeus bitterly wrote, and I quote, "They set up Pittacus, base of lineage, as tyrant of a city lacking bile and heavy with doom, with great praise from the crowd." Are we sure that we know a tyrant when we see one? Or is tyranny just name-calling, a disparaging term without substance? In his Leviathan of 1651, Thomas Hobbes wrote that tyranny is nothing more than monarchy misliked. Are tyrants always misliked. Thucydides regarded Pisistratus and his sons, the tyrants of Athens, as having ruled with virtue and intelligence. Plato's Hipparchus also offers a favorable account of Pisistratus' son, the eponymous Hipparchus, crediting him with wisdom and statesmanship. Tyrants are, in fact, often liked and misliked, even by the same people. Democratic Athens, prizing freedom and equality, defined itself in opposition to tyranny. In 514 BC, Harmodius and Aristogeiton killed Hipparchus, son of the late tyrant Pisistratus and brother of then tyrant Hippias. These are the tyrannicides. Athenians offered cult to these tyrannicides. Athenian citizens considered themselves to be tyrannicides in spirit. On the other hand, democratic Athens was often denounced as a tyrannical polis, a polis tyrannos, and Thucydides has Pericles and Cleon openly accept the moniker tyrant city. He also reports that the Athenians drove Alcibiades out of the city because they suspected him of tyranny. But in Aristophanes' Frogs of 405 BC, Dionysius mentions that the city loves and hates and wants Alcibiades back. It's unwise to reify the category tyrant or to lose sight of its many ambiguities. Such is my difficulty with the accounts of Mark Lilla and W.R. Newell in Tyranny, A New Interpretation, who firmly locate eros as the heart of tyranny. Newell argues, for example, that ancient Greek tyranny is characterized by the tyrant's own corrupting desires for power and pleasure. Then, by contrast, he says, modern tyranny is characterized by the tyrant's conquest of his own eros in the service of a grandiose historical mission. I agree that the Greek tradition's strength is to offer psychological understanding, particularly of tyrants themselves, and that's what I'll focus on in the first part of my lecture tonight. But we should avoid pretending that these emotions are clear and unambiguous, especially over time. Instead of eros, I propose to use fear as an initial stepping stone because, as we'll see, fear draws attention to the uncanniness of tyrannical psychology and even to the phenomenon of tyranny as a whole. Now, in saying that, I take my cue from the Enlightenment French philosopher Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu. In The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, Montesquieu divided political regimes into three types: republics, monarchies, and despotisms. He wanted to identify the principe of each type, not so much its formal structure as what makes it act, its driving or animating passion. For Montesquieu, the spring of action in popular government is virtue, in monarchy, honor, and in despotism, fear. In saying that, Montesquieu had in mind not only Eastern despotism, but also the Catholic Church and France's absolutist monarchy. Is fear, then, the essence of the tyrannical regime? Asking that question, and I intend to maintain it as a question, helps us to bridge the gap between ancients and moderns. Certain political philosophers have wondered whether tyranny is, after all, a useful category in the contemporary world, or has politics changed shape to such an extent that the idea of tyranny is now antiquated because of modernization, the scale of the nation state, or technology? This debate is part of a dialogue, explicit and implicit, among the 20th century thinkers Leo Strauss, who favored the language of tyranny, Alexandre Kojève, an unrepentant modernist, and Hannah Arendt, who complexified the picture, particularly with reference to totalitarianism. I would distinguish between the ancient tyrant's desire to dominate others and modern totalitarian ambitions to reconstruct the world, for example, by means of genocide. Intriguingly, on the other hand, the animating emotions of tyranny, such as fear, are arguably more constant over time. Not simply the strategic use of terror, but rather fear as the underlying principle and psychic basis of the regime. In democratic Athens, the most dramatic image of tyranny was that of the Persian king Xerxes. On the Persian army's march to Greece, the Lydian Pythias requested that his eldest son be spared military duty, whereupon Xerxes had the son's body cut in half and his army march between the halves. This theatrical use of violence is characteristic of tyranny and calls to mind Cesare Borgia's similar dismemberment of Ramiro di Orco in the public square in Machiavelli's The Prince, and to some extent Hitler's Night of the Long Knives in 1934. Fear is, however, more than a simple strategy. Seeking revenge for Marathon, Xerxes decided to invade Greece, emphasizing to the royal council his desire to live up to his royal ancestors' ambitions. Consciously, he was motivated by thumos, or spirit, rather than eros. Xerxes' advisors feared contradicting their master, a limitation of deliberative rationality under tyrants. Only Uncle Artabanus was courageous enough to mention that he had once advised his brother Darius, Xerxes' father, not to attack the Scythians to the west. Darius refused to listen, of course, and was defeated. He would have faced even greater disaster, as Artabanus indicated, if the Ionian Greeks had destroyed his bridge over the Thracian Bosphorus, a nod to Xerxes' plan to bridge the Hellespont. Well, Xerxes ridiculed his uncle's cowardice and misinterpreted the terrified conformism of his other advisors as manliness. Artabanus will stay home with the women. That night, though, Xerxes changed his mind about the expedition. During sleep, he was visited by a tall, noble phantom, Herodotus tells us, who said, "You're wrong to change, and there is one here who will not forgive you for doing so." Doesn't specify that one, but we may see eventually what he's talking about. Disregarding the phantom, Xerxes announced his change of mind publicly, whereupon the phantom appeared in another dream, addressing him as the son of Darius, criticizing him for renouncing the campaign and warning him that if he refused to fight, quote, "just as in a moment you rose to greatness and power, so in a moment will you be brought low again." Terrified, Herodotus reports, he undertook the campaign and, as we all know, suffered a disastrous defeat. The Athenian ideology contrasted the freedom-loving Greeks with tyrants who were controlled and controlled others by fear. The Greeks, according to this ideology, practiced a deliberate form of courage as opposed to Persians, whose artificial bravery was manufactured by the watchful gaze of the king's spies. Can we learn anything from this story that goes beyond this representation of democratic ideology? One recurrent detail is that Xerxes intends to renounce a plan that he had proclaimed publicly. Are tyrants allowed to change their minds? Xerxes is in thrall to his spirited ambitions. He expunges fear to such an extent that even prudent warnings are unmentionable. What else, though, is unthinkable for Xerxes? Herodotus mentions another, apparently unrelated factor in the lead-in to this story. The sons of Darius had recently disputed the succession, with the eldest son born before Darius' succession claiming heirship, and Xerxes disputing it on the grounds that he was the son of Atossa, the daughter of King Cyrus, who had won freedom for Persia. Was Xerxes gripped, even unbeknownst to himself, by a fear that his claim to the throne was illegitimate? Was he king only because of a woman, that is, his mother? Such was Herodotus' own hypothesis. In his first speech to his advisors, Xerxes emphasized his place in the royal line from Cyrus to Cambyses and then to Darius, but Darius himself was a usurper without an established place in the succession, which put great symbolic weight on the first succession to follow him. Under this pressure, Xerxes wondered whether he was a legitimate king, even the legitimate heir, the real son of Darius. Is he, or is he not, Darius' real son? And does he want to be, given Uncle Artabanus' long list of Darius' mistakes and failures? Behind the Athenian ideology, Herodotus' story raises psychologically profound questions that Xerxes does not want to know or confront. Gripped by terror in practice, he proceeds with the disastrous expedition and thereby proves to any doubters, including himself, that he is, in all ways, the worthy son of Darius, the Persians' greatest imperial failure prior to Xerxes. I don't want to excuse Xerxes by any means, but rather to make his story comprehensible. Even though Xerxes did atrocious tyrannical things, does his story not conform to a familiar tragic pattern in which he chooses self-ruin because of an underlying fear? My title promises an archaeology of tyrannical fear because, as archaeologists at the Canadian Institute of Greece will know, spadework unearths what is unexpected, like the unconscious. It's useful to focus on the patterns that tyrants or their peoples make manifest, but won't allow themselves to know or think what they consider unmentionable even to themselves. Often dreams or the god suggest this unconscious level. And as the chair of a political science department, I often worry that the modern social sciences focus on what people think they think without delving into the complexities of their unknown thoughts or their deeper psychic experiences. Classical writers located the origins of tyranny in fears, citizens' fears of internal oppression and external military threats. In Plato's Republic, Socrates argues that tyranny grows out of democracy by such means. In the guise of defending the people, certain unscrupulous demagogues liquidate the wealth of the rich for themselves and their mass of followers. The rich defend themselves in court and out of bitterness entertain oligarchic leanings. Whoever challenges a rising tyrant is persecuted as an enemy of the state. Even today, the first rule of the authoritarian toolkit is to raise the cost of dissent and to label those who disagree or other convenient targets as disloyal or enemies of the state. And a great example of this is Viktor Orban of Hungary, an authoritarian but grouped within my tyrant category writ large, who makes enemies of the state among those who proclaim the importance of freedom or an open society, such as the philanthropist George Soros, one of his key targets, despite the fact that Viktor Orban, it turns out, accepted a scholarship to university from Soros' own Open Society Foundation. The strategy of the rising tyrant for Socrates is to exploit the people's fear of oligarchic revolution. The people's defender ultimately oppresses his own supporters. Having initiated this process internally, the tyrant also stirs up external wars so that the people will need him to keep them safe. Need I point explicitly to any modern exemplars? Why did the tyrant engineer his coup? According to Socrates, eros, or desire, enslaves his soul, which gives rise to the conventional opinion that eros is the key tyrannical passion. The tyrant lives out in reality the unmentionable desires of nightmares: sex with a mother, parricide, dining on the flesh of one's own children. He is Oedipus or other tragic figures incarnate, and we can think back again to Xerxes. The climax of Socrates' account, though, places fear, not eros, at the center. Imagine, Socrates says, that a god abandons a wealthy slave owner in a deserted place with no security from his slaves' attacks. Socrates calls up the primal and nightmarish fear of a violent death. His argument is that the tyrant lives out a nightmare in waking life, terrified of his subjects' violence. Was Plato's view that tyrants are destroyed by their own fears and desires, was this view true? Was that Plato's own view, and is it true? Well, I hope that it's not Plato's own view, because apparently it is just not true. World leaders across the spectrum, and I'll let you figure out which side each leader is on, although some are more obvious than others. But these folks seem to be doing fine, both psychologically and in politics. So let's dig deeper. Socrates' picture of tyranny is intended rhetorically. He's exhorting Glaucon and Adimantus, or rather their counterparts in the reading audience, not to seek tyranny. More proximately, he's exhorting them not to seek political power in democratic Athens. The philosophical life is the best human life. Political life will disfigure their souls. And as a department chair, again, I say that this is actually true, that the political life will disfigure your soul. Socrates' rhetoric is to the point because Glaucon had fantasized that anyone with a ring of invisibility, that is, Gyges' ring, would steal with impunity, have sex with anyone he wished, kill others, release prisoners, be a god among mortals. The tyrant's waking nightmare, as Socrates calls it, is this young man's way of living the dream, that is, the dream of sex, freedom, and power. Socrates tries to persuade the young men that tyrannical desires are no comedy. His tyrant is the hero of his own politically orchestrated Greek tragedy, killing his father, having sex with his mother, that is, violating deeply important laws and conventions, and finally becoming the victim of a violent demotic revolution or of his angry wife, Clytemnestra. It would be restrictive and distorting to reduce ancient tyranny to victimization by eros. Even fear is only a starting point, but a useful one because, according to Socrates, our dreams make it clear that there is a dangerous, wild, and lawless form of desire in everyone, even in those of us who seem to be entirely moderate or measured. Socrates was looking at Glaucon when he said that, or perhaps outward at Glaucon's doppelganger in the audience. Think, for example, for an ancient example, of Aristophanes' character Philocleon, a tyrannically democratic man, irresistibly intoxicated by power, who, as an Athenian juror, revels in taking bribes, arbitrarily doling out pity and anger, ignoring the laws, being flattered by demagogues, likened to Zeus and unaccountable for his actions. Socrates' idea genuinely is frightening, and it's intended to be that Athenian democrats, perhaps like us, are tyrants, all tragic figures whose lives will end badly owing to their own faults and ignorance. But it's critical for us still to remain dispassionate and to look further into what this idea actually means. Naomi Klein's latest book, Doppelganger, includes a chapter entitled The Nazi in the Mirror. In committing their atrocities, the Nazis were careful students of the British colonial treatment of Africans and American and Canadian treatment of blacks and indigenous. Klein quotes W.E.B. Du Bois as follows: "There was no Nazi atrocity which the Christian civilization of Europe had not long been practicing against colored folk in all parts of the world, in the name of and for the defense of a superior race born to rule the world." Whether Du Bois was historically correct about the Holocaust or not, we tend to fear seeing familiar acts of tyranny so much that we usually don't. How about the ancient Athenians, whom Socrates addressed? Readers of Thucydides will be aware of the Athenians' imperial self-justifications abroad. Equally, they observed the Athenians' massacres of other Greeks, not to mention non-Greeks, or the international slave trade. At Torone in 422, Athenians sent away the men to Athens and enslaved the women and children, At Scione, 421, Milos, 416, they killed the men and enslaved the women and children. The Athenians' 175 tributary Greek states describe themselves as enslaved and Athens as a tyrant polis. Did the atrocities of the polis tyrannos, like those of Socrates' tyrant, turn back upon the city of Athens itself? Thucydides, for one, encouraged his readers to see things that way when the imperial democracy gave way to the terror, for example, of 400 oligarchs in 411 BC. Imperial Athens was a tragic hero, motivated, as the Athenians say, by fear, honor, and self-interest. I want to propose now that another Platonic dialogue, the Gorgias, helps us to understand the imperial dynamic within the city. It illustrates the Aristotelian point, or as Aristotle captured the point anyway, that any citizen trained to dominate foreign peoples must attempt, he said, to pursue the capability to rule his own city. Callicles, Socrates' leading interlocutor in the Gorgias, self-consciously identifies with the tradition's overreaching tyrants, such as Xerxes. He idealizes the rule of the stronger, who seek to have more in a specifically imperial way. He provides evidence, as he thinks, that it's naturally just for the stronger to rule and have a greater share. In recent history, he says, one can point, however ineptly, to Xerxes' campaigns against Greece or Darius' campaigns against Scythia, both examples for him of interstate imperialism. Callicles wants to live the dream of the free, powerful, and manly life that rule of the stronger makes possible. That description sounds a lot like Gyges' ring and the imperial Athenians of Thucydides. Intriguingly, as Thucydides describes, Alcibiades had proposed the Sicilian expedition, which was as ambitious and disastrous as Xerxes' imperialistic campaigns. Callicles could easily have cited Alcibiades and Athenian imperialism alongside his examples of Persian imperialism. In short, Callicles has internalized the Athenian discourse on imperialism, in which the Athenians' ambassadors in Thucydides advanced an ideal of having more that was indifferent to admirable leadership, that scorned justice, that promoted crass materialism and tyrannical power. When questioned by Socrates, Callicles turns out to be a confused and self-contradictory young man like Xerxes. When he's not an aspiring tyrant, he's a complainer. Conventional justice is nothing more, he says, than a weapon of the weak, a strategy of power developed to prevent strong men, such as himself, from satisfying their desires. According to Callicles, these weak, ordinary people make laws and use myths to frighten powerful men, like Callicles, in order to keep them from having the goods and status they rightly deserve. In digging down into Callicles' complaints, we discover the ancient politics of grievance. Doesn't Callicles sound, after all, like the bloggers of today's manosphere, who blame women and equity programs for refusing to recognize their own unproven greatness? As classical antiquity's first incel, he provides interesting links to contemporary populism. Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land tells the story of the white, mostly male Louisiana citizens who supported the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. They are angry and act out a politics of grievance because they feel dispossessed, in the sense that, in Hochschild's memorable image, women, blacks, and other minorities are cutting in line and receiving unfair preferential treatment in the new order created by the likes of Barack Obama. What emerges most vividly from Socrates' cross-examination of Callicles is the young man's fearfulness, his fear of suffering physical harm from the Athenian demos, and ultimately his fear of dying. In making these points, I'm building on an important essay by Emily Austin, who's argued that Callicles', quote, sense of himself as an exceptional person is held hostage by his fear. Callicles wants to become politically powerful, as he repeatedly emphasizes, because, I quote, no man would put up with suffering what's unjust. Only a slave would do so, one who's better dead than alive, who, when he's treated unjustly and abused, can't protect himself or anyone else he cares about. Callicles' admiration for strong men grows out of his fear of suffering harm, ultimately an anxiety about mortality, but more proximately an anxiety about the loss of status. When Callicles advises Socrates to practice rhetoric so as to protect himself in the law courts and even to save his own life, Socrates exhorts his young friend to stop being so cowardly. Once Socrates' points are thought through, Callicles' pseudo-philosophical debunking of justice melts away and reveals an underlying existential fear. He presents Socrates with grandiose delusions in order to mask his sense of vulnerability. At the bottom of his desire for dominance is fear of extinction, whether corporeal or social. He is no more and no less than the white men in Louisiana described by Hochschild, whose politics of grievance is fueled by fear. I should know because I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. Callicles feels tyrannized by democratic politics and conceives of an anti-democratic politics because of his fears. Where else are the tyrannized people in this story? Where is the demos in the story? The Athenian demos eschewed responsibility for supporting tyrants. In 560 BC, Pisistratus tricked them, they said, into welcoming him back in a chariot led by Athena. Then and now, people have participated in such political pageantry at the courts of tyrants. And historians have often raised questions about how willing or coercive their participation was. Classical Greeks, intriguingly, refused to think about this question. Such was their fear of being thought to support tyranny. How then to understand the people's role? Giuliano da Empolis, the Wizard of the Kremlin, may shed light on this question. This is the debut novel of a Swiss and Italian essayist, published in 2022, featuring a fictional conversation between an American academic and a retired propagandist, Vadim Baranov, who had served Vladimir Putin and whom many believe to be a stand-in for figures such as Vladislav Surkov or Alexander Dugin, since Baranov is called in the novel Putin's Rasputin and Putin's brain. Its leading idea is that a tyrant's success is based on the power of his artistic vision of society. Early on, Baranov says that a certain dissident and Joseph Stalin, quote, were two avant-garde artists vying for supremacy. The forces on either side were disproportionate, of course, as Stalin's medium was the flesh and blood of his people, his canvas a vast nation, his public the inhabitants of an entire planet. The novel comments less, though, on Putin's own psychology than on his ability to address the Russian people's anger and fear. On the eve of an upcoming election, Putin expresses concern about his approval ratings. Baranov assures him that they're at 60%, with his nearest rival at 12%. No, Putin says, there is a Russian leader more popular than I am, namely Stalin. The people loved Stalin, he says, not in spite of his massacres, but because of them. Stalin knew how to deal with traitors and thieves by making a bloody spectacle of their punishment, which sated the people's anger and satisfied their sense of justice. Although Baranov identifies anger as a primordial motive force, we might still wonder what, if anything, underlies the people's anger. Anger is an emotional stimulus to action, and therefore tends to remain on the surface, covering over more profound emotions and mediating between them and the world outside, as we saw in Callicles' case. When there was a shortage of butter, eggs, or beef, Stalin satisfied the people's anger by means of a grotesque spectacle, yes. But the underlying issue was that the people were starving. They feared mortality in a direct way. In other situations, they fear losing their identity or way of life. Baranov points continuously to Putin's effort to eliminate the decadent liberal elite of Boris Yeltsin's New Russia, billionaires with a Silicon Valley lifestyle. The people admired Putin's efforts because they feared losing the real Russia, which was exemplified by Cossacks on horses, by reborn Roman patricians and imperialists who spurned the West's self-indulgent materialism and its leaders with fancy suits. Politics, understood in the Russian way, within the framework of the novel, has in view bigger game than pleasure. In explaining the rise of Putin, whom he calls the Tsar, Baranov says, quote, his language speaks of life, of death, honor, and country. Governing is not an activity that can be left to the feckless. Politics has just one goal, to address men's terrors, a human constant that has never changed. Putin addresses the people's existential terror by turning himself into a mortal god who has become an element almost, Baranov says, like the sky or the wind, whose face has already acquired the marble-like pallor of immortality. In that guise, he could address his people's existential terror, the worry among Russians under Yeltsin that their lives had no meaning, and indeed that Russianness itself was under threat. Ultimately, the Russians fear national extinction as such. Perhaps this passion is the deepest one touched on by the novel. As Putin and his propagandists thunder, Russia must not, Russia will not suffer, and I quote, suffer a big color-coded revolution in Moscow, a new president with maybe a master's from Yale, and Bush Jr. Bush Jr. could star in another of those masquerades he liked so much, mission accomplished, but this time coming to you directly from Red Square. Now, in saying that, Putin is, of course, alluding to a propagandistic moment from 2003, in which George W. Bush claimed victory in Iraq, prematurely, as we soon learned. Russia must not be led at its heart in Red Square by a degenerate liberal suit from Yale. And I must say, as a Princeton graduate, I very much enjoyed that sentence, one of the best of the novel. Putin's answer was a quasi-heroic national response that reasserted Russia's belief in its own ability to dominate others, as in Ukraine. And Baranov kept that conception alive in a variety of propagandistic displays, as in the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. Giuliano d'Empoli has been variously praised for his profound understanding of what he called the devil's own perspective, and criticized for what some see as his celebratory repackaging of Kremlin ideology. To me, the novel lays out for us a number of important connections between tyranny and fear that resonate with ancient Greek politics. Today, in the backsliding European and North American democracies, it challenges us to ask whether liberal democracy has its own large vision to offer, its own way of addressing primal terror, its own justifications for a healthy politics that goes beyond fear. If a concept such as the audacity of hope is no longer a viable option, then how can we best heal democracy's current malaise? Thank you very much.
Oof. Thank you so much for this very enlightening lecture presentation. It was very good. The principle of our Paris Arnopoulos lecture series is that we have our guest lecturers, and then we have two eminent scholars, Greek scholars, that we invite to react and give to the presentation. And so I would now like to invite Dr. Lambrini. Is it? No. You changed the.
We did.
Oh, okay, that's okay.
I thought it would be a little less related, but it looks very close to it.
Okay, so
Shall I?
yes, please, Dr. Chloe Bala, who will be speaking, addressing the question of philosophical education as a prophylactic against tyranny.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Yeah, I had proposed to go last because looking at Lambrini's abstract, I thought it would be closer to Ryan's, which I didn't have a chance to look at before. But as it turns out, you're very close. So, dear Professor Perreault, dear friends and colleagues, let me start by thanking the Canadian Institute in Greece for inviting me to contribute at this panel. I have known and admired Ryan's work, Ryan Balot's, for a long time, and when I accepted the invitation, I thought it would be fit to contribute with a topic which touches upon his earlier work on greed and injustice in classical Athens, and is at the same time, or it is hence also related to the topic of today's meeting, approaches on tyranny. So the title of my talk is Philosophical Education as a Prophylactic Against Tyranny, and there will be an overlap with some of the things that Ryan said, but I hope you will not be bored. I will be focusing on Plato primarily. So I start with a reference to George Seferis because I noticed a miraculous coincidence on March 31, 1971, 55 years before our meeting here today. George Seferis signed his last poem titled Over the Aspalathus Bushes, Epi Aspalathon. Many of us here are certainly familiar with this poem. I have a small handout with text, so it's not necessary to follow my talk, but for those of you who are not familiar with the poem, it's there in Keely's translation. So many of us here are certainly familiar with this poem, which is included in the compulsory readings of the Greek high school curriculum. In the midst of the Greek military dictatorship, the colonel's junta, which lasted from April 1967 to July 1973, and in sharp contrast to the current practice of using the ancient Greek past to foster nationalist sentiment, Seferis borrows from Plato a statement against tyranny. The long needles of the aspalathus bushes that grow around the rusty stones of the temple of Poseidon at Sunion remind the poet of the tyrant's punishment, who in the last book of the Republic is torn apart over the aspalathoi. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and that is presumably why both Seferis and Plato allude to the image of the punishment of Ardieus, the tyrant. Plato is the first author who talks about the educational value of literature and who introduces a new kind of literature, a new genre, that of philosophical dialogue, Socratiki logi, and who develops, as I will try to show, his vision of philosophical education as a prophylactic against tyranny. Throughout his dialogues, Plato contrasts his vision of philosophical education to what he describes as rhetorical or sophistic education. Here, I will focus on Gorgias, not only because it is a dialogue that showcases the contrast between the moral values of rhetoric and those of philosophy, but also because it associates training in rhetoric with tyranny. Let me start with the figure of Callicles, Socrates' interlocutor in the dialogue Gorgias, who hosts Gorgias and admires the training in rhetorical education his guest professes to offer. Inspired by the latter, Callicles challenges the idea of traditional morality, describing it as the outcome of nomoi, laws or conventions. The only reason why the weak agree to comply with such conventions is to protect themselves from the natural greed of the strong. And I'm glad you didn't read the whole text, because I will read the paragraph. So that's Callicles speaking in Plato's Gorgias. But I suppose the makers of the laws are the weaker sort of men and the more numerous. So it is with a view to themselves and their own interests that they make their laws and distribute their praises and censures. And to terrorize the stronger sort of folk who are able to get an advantage and to prevent them from getting one over them, they tell them that such aggrandizement is foul and unjust, and that wrongdoing is just this endeavor to get the advantage of one's neighbors. For I expect they are well content to see themselves on an equality when they are so inferior. So this is why by convention it is termed unjust and foul to aim at an advantage over the majority, and why they call it wrongdoing. But nature, in my opinion, herself proclaims the fact that it is right for the better to have advantage of the worse and the abler of the feebler. It is obvious in many cases that this is so, not only in the animal world, but in the states and races collectively of men, that right has been decided to consist in the sway and advantage of the stronger over the weaker. For by what manner of right did Xerxes march against Greece, or his father against Scythia? Callicles bases his speech on the so-called nomos physis antithesis, the contrast between, on the one hand, the blind and yet objective force of nature, and on the other hand, the subjective laws and conventions humans construct in order to counter the greed of the strong. The most salient premise of his speech is that greed, pleonexia, is a fundamental natural drive of human beings. Callicles' speech triggers a contrast that shapes the second part of the dialogue between the political life as construed by 5th century Athenians and the life of philosophy as represented by Socrates. Plato's construal of political life ties in with his criticism of rhetoric. The main points of that criticism are the following. Rhetoric is not a real art, but rather an empirical skill. Unlike a real art, it has no interest in the good. Its aim is persuasion at all costs. It pays no attention to truth, the content of the ideas it wishes to promote. It pays no attention to the means through which it exercises persuasion. Socrates in Gorgias identifies rhetoric with flattery. Last but not least, it pays no attention to the intellectual and hence also, from the perspective of Socrates, to the moral disposition of the agents who form the audience. Plato argues that personal ambition is the main drive of people who are committed to the education Gorgias professes to offer. Polus, Gorgias' follower and Socrates' interlocutor in the Gorgias, admires the art of rhetoric because it gives people the greatest power in the cities, allowing them, like tyrants, to put to death anyone they want and confiscate the property and banish from their cities anyone they see fit. By flattering and manipulating the emotions of their audience and drawing on a toolkit of argumentative tricks, professional teachers of rhetoric, at least according to Plato's rather unfavorable presentation, would generate speeches to promote any given thesis. This practice obviously anticipates that of a modern marketing or political campaign, which can now further rely on AI-generated speeches. Endorsing Plato's skepticism towards sophistic education, Aristotle describes the nomos physis contrast as a widespread topos, which allows people like Callicles to utter paradoxes and hence to produce the intrinsically amoral thesis that Plato attributes to him. Plato's audience would be able to draw the connection between Callicles' speech and the pessimistic anthropology that permeates Thucydides' history, which shows how, as soon as the constraints of social structure are removed, human beings reveal their real egoistic nature. The locus classicus is, of course, the famous dialogue that purportedly took place between the Melians and the Athenians, which the Canadian Prime Minister Macartney recently invoked in his speech at Davos. In a different part of his history of the Peloponnesian War, in Pericles' funeral oration, Thucydides draws attention to the pursuit of wisdom that 5th century Athenians considered as a mark of their identity. Pursuit or love of wisdom, philosophia, should be construed here in a rather broad, pre-technical sense, to include the art of language, art of argumentation, skill in linguistic competence that was practiced or at least associated with the so-called sophists. It is against such a loosely construed idea of philosophy that Plato would rather describe as sophistry or rhetoric, that Plato in the Republic launches, so against this idea of philosophy, which is loosely constrained, Plato launches his philosophical curriculum, which combines mathematics with a new conception of dialectic that separates it from the sophists' superficial training in argumentation. Mathematical sciences and the Platonic forms, the objects of Plato's curriculum, are now presented as the objects that will nourish the highest and most noble part of the soul, which properly pertains to human nature and is contrasted with the lower part, which forms the seat of insatiable appetites that drove the rather beastly nature of a man like Callicles, who many scholars consider as a character fabricated by Plato. And that is why the philosophers of the Republic, people who will have no ambition to rule, let alone any interest to satisfy their greed, become the ideal rulers. Plato's understanding of human nature challenges the idea that might makes right and shows that the driving force of a human being qua human being is no longer appetite but reason, logos, which is properly nourished by philosophy. To answer Glaucon's challenge in the beginning of the dialogue, why not pursue the natural human drive of greed, pleonexia, Plato offers a new understanding of the human psyche, the so-called tripartite psychology, and develops an educational curriculum which cultivates its highest part, the logistikon, the rational part, in order to showcase the contrast between the happiest life, which is the life of the philosopher, to the most miserable, which is the life of the tyrant. how effective Plato's philosophical education was for those who joined his academy is not a question that we can answer with much certainty, and I'm not proposing here that we should adopt it as a solution. Historians have argued that the Platonic Academy never was, quote, either during Plato's lifetime or in the following centuries, a political cell that pursued a specific political agenda. It never realized Platonic ideas in the sphere of politics, end of quote. But what about readers of the Republic, or the members of the groups who attended the public reading, the performance of Plato's dialogue, without necessarily being committed to a Platonic philosophical education? Plato's contemporaries would not miss the connotations of Socrates' visit at Perreault during a time when Athens could still enjoy its strong economy at its port to the sea, a symbol of its empire, but also, with hindsight, the scene of the battle between the Democrats and the 30 tyrants in 403. The dialogue starts with a survey of ill-founded conceptions of justice that Socrates is prepared to refute. Some of these conceptions are proposed by wealthy metics who have good intentions, but who do not demonstrate the philosophical stamina that will later allow Glaucon and Adimantus, Plato's brothers, who become Socrates' interlocutors in the ensuing books of the Republic, to follow the praise of philosophy and the blame of tyranny. The example of Cephalus, the successful metic who hosts Socrates and who in the dramatic date of the Republic can still enjoy his wealth and treat logoi, speeches or arguments, as an entertainment, a pleasurable pastime, while his world is about to fall apart, his fortune and family will soon be destroyed, is a strong signal against intellectual laziness. Readers of the Republic or those who enjoyed its performance can ask the question, what would have happened if the 30 tyrants had trained their souls in philosophy, so that instead of being driven by pleonexia, greed, they were driven by a Platonic conception of the good? But also, and likewise, what would have happened if the demos, the sovereign body of the Athenian democracy, had received the kind of critical training through which Plato's Socrates tried to cultivate the souls of his interlocutors? Even if, in answering the above questions, we endorse Thucydides' pessimistic anthropology, and even if we remain skeptical, as we're likely to do, about the effects of philosophical education, we can still admire the resilience of Plato's moral concerning the fate of the tyrant Ardeus, and we can retain our commitment to education and civic engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Balot. Thank you very much. Education. Education is a key word. As much as I like the word accomplished, there's maybe we could get rid of the
I will change it because
you have a and I will now thank you. Invite our last speaker for this evening, Professor Rory, who has just come back from Canada and from far west Canada, Vancouver. She will be focusing on whether fear alone can explain contemporary anti-democratic politics. Please, thank you very much for being with us. You will find it.
I lost the flow. No, I might need some help. Το κάνει αυτό, καμιά φορά μπλοκάρει.
I'm not very good at that.
Σαν να μπλοκάρει είναι λίγο.
It's frozen.
Yes, it's frozen. I cannot close it from there. Ah, okay. Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Canadian Institute in Athens and Professor Perreault for giving me this wonderful opportunity for this intellectual and stimulating exchange with two distinguished professors, Professor Balot and Professor Balla. My intervention starts from Ryan Balot's question: is fear the governing principle of tyranny? My answer is that fear remains indispensable, but it cannot by itself explain much contemporary anti-democratic politics. To understand why citizens can come to tolerate or even endorse exclusion, hostility, and violence, we also need a second emotional register, which is ressentiment. By ressentiment, I mean not a passing resentment or anger, but a chronic and moralized constellation of wounded entitlement, injustice, humiliation, envy, and powerlessness. My argument is that this affective mechanism helps explain how democratic erosion can emerge from within democracies themselves. It does not require a fully consolidated tyrant in place. It can develop in crisis conditions through ordinary citizens' interpretations of injury, betrayal, and blocked agency. I will draw mainly on my recent work with Teresa Kapelos and Vasiliki Georgiadou on the Greek financial crisis, which was published in European Politics and Society, and I will show how a typology of political orientations help us map which emotional patterns are most closely linked to anti-democratic action. Then I will return to Professor Balot's talk and suggest why fear names one route to tyranny and ressentiment names another, the slow corrosion of democratic norms from below. And finally, I will try to connect with Professor Balla's emphasis on philosophical education as a prophylactic against tyranny. And I say I will try to because I'm not a theorist and I'm not a philosopher and I do empirical political science. So I hope that it relates to what you have said. So let me start by locating my intervention to what you have just heard. Ryan Balot gives us this powerful archaeology of tyranny built around fear, ambition, and power. That is the right point of departure because fear remains central to despotism in both classical and modern forms. As I said, I think that fear alone cannot explain the current contemporary dynamics that we live in democracies. We need to understand how citizens themselves can become receptive to exclusionary or violent politics, and this chronic emotional mechanism to which I refer transforms grievance into moralized hostility. In that sense, my argument does not replace Professor Balot's account, but it supplements it by shifting attention from the tyrant and the regime principle to the emotional life of publics under crisis. That is also where I will connect to Professor Balla. If anti-democratic dispositions can emerge not only through overt domination, but through affective corrosion from within, then philosophical education becomes more than a defense against an external tyrant. It becomes a defense against those emotional patterns, such as victimhood, wounded entitlement, moral superiority, hostility to pluralism, that make tyranny thinkable and perhaps even desirable. So here is the conceptual move I want to make. Fear and ressentiment are not the same thing, and they organize political life differently. Fear is usually immediate and threat-focused. It helps us understand obedience, withdrawal, and submission under coercive conditions. This is why it is so powerful in classical analysis of tyranny, like the ones that we have heard today. A ressentiment, by contrast, is not a fleeting fear response. In our work, we treat it as a chronic and moralized sense of powerlessness, envy, and injustice that transforms frustration into hostility toward perceived offenders. It is less about immediate danger than about enduring injury. It says, I have been wronged, I have been displaced, others have advanced unfairly, and therefore retaliation or exclusion is justified. That difference matters analytically. Fear explains how subjects can be ruled. Ressentiment helps explain how citizens can become anti-democratic without already living under a tyrant. It captures the affective route through which grievance becomes moral superiority, scapegoating, and acceptance of extreme measures. In contemporary politics, of course, these emotions often interact. Fear of decline, outsiders, or loss can fuse with ressentiment about humiliation and blocked agency. Okay. Now, a little bit about the case study. Why Greece? Because the Greek financial crisis offers a particularly sharp view of how democratic stress reshapes emotional life. In the paper, we argue that the crisis created a fertile environment for radicalization, severe economic decline, austerity, weakened public services, distrust toward domestic elites and international institutions, and deep social disillusionment. Importantly, this was not only a story about one ideological camp. The period saw the coexistence of far-right and far-left radicalism and extremism, which makes Greece especially useful for examining mechanisms that cut across ideology. In other words, the Greek case let us ask not only who became radicalized, but why grievances were channeled differently toward progressive action in some cases, but mainly toward reactionary or violent politics in the vast majority. This shows that anti-democratic politics can incubate inside a democratic crisis before a tyrannical regime is fully formed. Citizens can lose trust, reinterpret institutions as corrupt or unjust, and become more willing to see illegal or violent action as legitimate. That is precisely where ressentiment becomes useful. It helps us understand how socioeconomic hardship becomes moralized hostility rather than merely policy dissatisfaction. So our main analytic tool is this typology of political orientations. Instead of assuming that ideology alone explains anti-democratic action, we distinguish orientation along those two dimensions: the temporal direction of change, backward, status quo, or forward-looking, and the urgency of change, whether we want it urgently, gradually, or the maintenance of the status quo, so static. That yields 5 orientations. Reactionary means an urgent return to a perceived better past. Radical means abrupt, systematic transformation toward a new order. Retrogressive means gradual restoration of traditional values. Progressive means gradual reform through legal and institutional means. And conservative means preserving the present order. This framework lets us compare actors who may be ideologically opposed but psychologically similar in their stance toward change. That is especially important for ressentiment. Our argument is that ressentiment is not reducible to one ideology. It can animate both far-right and far-left grievances, although it is especially intense in backward-looking orientations. So this typology helps us move beyond the crude opposition between fear on one side and ideology on the other. And it permits to ask how emotional orientations towards time, loss, and change shape anti-democratic preferences. Now, what exactly ressentiment does? The mechanism is political because it does not stop at private emotion. It converts grievance into a moral and interpretative framework. A crisis produces hardship, humiliation, and perceived betrayal. But grievance alone does not tell us who will support anti-democratic politics. The key intermediary is whether those grievances are lived as blocked agency, envy, injured status, and powerlessness. At that point, ressentiment emerges. What changes is not just intensity, but also the moral structure. One begins to see oneself or one's group as the righteous victim, while opponents, elites, minorities, experts, or institutions are recast as corrupt offenders. This is what we call the transformation of frustration into hostility toward perceived offenders. That is the point at which exclusion, punitive politics, and even violence can start to appear morally warranted. And also, this is where my intervention connects to the tyranny conversation. Tyranny is not only a matter of fear imposed on subjects, it can also be prepared by citizens who come to feel morally entitled to redress or revenge. And crucially, this sequence is not inevitable. Our work shows that hope and efficacy can interrupt this, which is important for how we think about democratic remedies. Very briefly on the method, I will not spend much time on this. Our study stems from focus groups that were conducted in 2014 and 2015. We conducted 5 focus groups, and we have coded 418 statements systematically by 4 different coders, and our intercoder reliability was very high, higher than 90%. The important point is that the unit of analysis is the statement and not the individual person. That allows the analysis to focus on collective discursive patterns, the way that people narrate their grievances, they justify their action, and frame political conflict. In other words, orientations are treated as meaning structures that circulate in talk and social interpretation, and not simply as stable psychological threads residing inside isolated individuals. And the coding scheme captured 3 things central to our typology and argument. First, the political orientations that I have already described. Second, the action types, whether legal, illegal, violent, or no action. And ressentiment and related affective indicators, such as efficacy, hope, and nostalgia. Now to the results. The first clear pattern is that the orientations closest to anti-democratic action are the urgent ones, the reactionary and the radical. Reactionary statements were most likely to endorse illegal action, while radical statements showed the highest support for violence. Progressive statements were by far the least permissive of both. That shows that the danger does not arise simply from dissatisfaction or conservatism in general. What makes the difference is the combination of urgency and emotional framing. Urgent orientations are the ones most likely to treat existing institutions as intolerable and to legitimate transgressive action. But they do so for different reasons. Reactionary actors want restoration, whereas radical actors want rupture. This helps qualify Professor Balot's emphasis on fear. If fear were the whole story, we might expect withdrawal or submission. But what we see here, by contrast, is mobilization towards illegal or violent action. That points us toward emotions that do not merely cow subjects, but morally energize them. Ressentiment is particularly helpful for understanding the reactionary pole, while radicalism shows how efficacy and urgency can also drive violence when hope in institutional change collapses. The second major result concerns the tipping points that move statements from legal or inactive positions toward anti-democratic action. We show that lower hope and greater powerlessness matter a great deal, but crucially that efficacy matters too. This is not a story of pure helplessness. It is a story of disempowered injury that becomes politically energized. The strongest predictors of anti-democratic action were radically and reactionary orientations, together with higher efficacy, lower hope, and greater powerlessness. That is a striking combination. It means that people are not simply afraid or resigned, they feel wronged, they no longer believe institutional channels will deliver justice, but they do feel capable of acting. That is precisely the kind of emotional constellation in which moralized aggression can become politically legitimate. So, let me go to the next slide. What I want to show here is that we do not displace fear as an account of tyranny. Rather, we suggest that we should distinguish two routes that often converge in modern anti-democratic politics. One route is domination from above, fear, ambition, power, and coercion. And that is the route that Professor Balot foregrounded in his speech, and it remains very indispensable. And the second route is corrosion from within democratic life itself. And here the driver is not only fear, but humiliation, injustice, wounded status, and ressentiment. Citizens begin to detach from democratic norms, not simply because they are intimidated, but because they no longer recognize pluralism, institutions, or opponents as legitimate. In that context, anti-democratic politics can be desired as well as feared. Yes, I think I will now move to Professor Balot's intervention on philosophical education. As a prophylactic against tyranny, I very much like this. So I find that framing very productive. And our paper suggests one extension of it. If education is to be genuinely prophylactic, it must not only prepare us to identify the tyrant or denounce fear. It must also help us recognize the emotional dispositions that make tyrannical or illiberal politics attractive in the first place. In that sense, philosophical education has an affective as well as cognitive task. It must teach citizens to distinguish injury from moral entitlement, critique from scapegoating, and agency from vengeance. It must cultivate a form of judgment that neither romanticizes grievance nor ignores it. This is important because ressentiment thrives when powerlessness is fused with moral self-certainty. So my liaison to Professor Balla is that the prophylactic against tyranny should include education in the emotional life of democracy. That means historical literacy, emotional self-knowledge, pluralistic judgment, and forms of efficacy that do not require enemies to be demonized. If fear is what tyranny imposes, ressentiment is often what democratic education must help citizens metabolize before it hardens into anti-democratic politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, all three of you, and Professor Rori. It's extremely, I love this. I love this formula we have to bring in eminent scholars, different fields, look at things from different angles, and we learn so much. We learn so much, and it makes my mind go. It is now your turn. The audience, if you have any questions, if you have any remarks, please, I'll and yeah, we're okay.
Thanks. This is specifically for Dr. Balot. You had mentioned something about tyrants have unmentionables. They have unmentionable fears and nightmares. I'm wondering if you, as a political scientist, can give us your thoughts on what are some of those unmentionable fears and nightmares that a present person who would like to become a global tyrant, President Trump, what are some of those things that you think, those unmentionables that he may have?
Is that okay? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, of course, among psychoanalysts and psychologists, it's very much frowned upon to analyze a sitting president in that way. But since I'm not one of those, merely a political scientist, not even a political scientist, but a political theorist, I'll speculate a little bit. So, I mean, it seems to me that you obviously on the surface see a desire to dominate in someone like Donald Trump. Let's just take him as an example. He wants to make America great again. He wants to Stephen Miller did that. He wants to shake up institutions. He wants to leave his stamp on everything, such as the dollar bill, such as the Kennedy Center, etc. I mean, if you had to guess, what all of those things would suggest is what all of those things, like commemorating his name, would suggest is a fear of being forgotten, right? Just the desire to commemorate himself. But there's another layer that I see. Again, I'm just speculating. I'm not a special student of the current presidency, but it seems to me that what you see in his need for constant adulation from his own advisors. He's got the problem that Xerxes had because nobody will tell him anything other than he already thinks. Good advice is equivalent to guessing what is in Donald Trump's mind. This desire for adulation seems to be pretty well diagnosed by his own relative, Mary Trump, who actually is a psychologist, when she said that, it is, I mean, it sounds a little crazy to say, but ultimately when you get to its root, a fear of being unworthy, a fear of being unloved, and a fear, I think, a fear of nothingness despite his own apparent nihilism. So that's how I understand it. I mean, again, this is just speculation, but yeah.
Would Professor Rory or Bala wish to add anything to comment on this one, or you may say?
Well, let me say I'm unprepared also to answer that question, but not ashamed to go on. See, I think that you get a lot of window dressing when you listen to somebody like Donald Trump. You get a lot of rhetoric, a lot of big talk and fancy talk, and a lot of what he's expressing and appealing to is precisely what Professor Rory was talking about, the people's resentment. That is undoubtedly the case. And I suppose that it's very interesting that to have political philosophers and social scientists, political scientists tackling this issue, because it leads me to believe that we need to speak more often to one another. Because I think that in the analysis of the emotions, there's no denying Professor Rory's results, the results of her interviewing and so on, but in the conceptual analysis of these emotions, the question I have is whether Donald Trump's own apparent resentment and ressentiment and that of his followers, whether that should be taken as at face value or whether it comes from something deeper inside him or those other people. And I suppose that's the question that I was getting at in my lecture. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for our distinguished guest? Yes.
Thank you very much, all of you, for these very insightful lectures. I would like to go back to the idea of the archaeology of tyranny, maybe literally even. If we go to the 6th century BC, we see that early tyrants also did things for the good, public works, especially waterworks, water supplies. Think of Aristodemus in Kymi in southern Italy, Polycrates in Samos, Pisistratus in Athens, and also in Naxos. Tyrants did a lot of work on waterworks. And we also have the archaeology of this. Now, how does that relate to the emphasis that you put on fear and as a prime concept, as a prime element of tyranny? Are the examples that I just mentioned, are these, let's say, early manifestations of tyranny, either in individual careers or maybe in the phenomenon of tyranny? Maybe to make a comparison with Hitler, in his early days, he constructed Autobahns and Volkswagens as sort of good things for the German people, and then later his regime was much more based on fear. How would you relate these two things?
Colleagues. Well, so I'll take a stab at your question. I mean, certainly, as I said more toward the beginning of my talk, tyranny covers a lot of ground. It is a loose concept. And as you know, many of the 7 sages were tyrants, for example. Many tyrants. Pisistratus nowadays, in our current historical reconstructions, is often thought to have been to have conferred many benefits on the city of Athens, in particular starting by reducing the possibility of civil war through aristocratic infighting, and that his tyranny, for example, led the way to democracy by giving the demos a greater self-consciousness of itself as a collective unit than it would have had under the old aristocratic or elite order. So I think at the time, and nowadays people recognize that figures called tyrants can do good things. And some of the studies that I mentioned, for example, Newell's book, Tyranny and New Interpretation, we'll talk about this in the case of Julius Caesar, or in the case of Kemal Ataturk. In the modern world, people who are thought of as tyrants have often had a missionary vision to carry out. Okay, and I guess the question is, what level of suffering was involved in carrying out that mission? I mean, even if you accept the mission, and in many cases you won't accept the mission, but let's say Ataturk's modernization program, for example. So I just think that that looseness makes it, in a sense, almost impossible to answer your question, because if you're looking at the positive side of tyranny in the case of Pisistratus, did the people fear Pisistratus? Well, I think what they feared was aristocratic infighting, and he solved that problem for them. Did he then oppress them? Our sources say that he didn't. Aristotle would respond to that by saying, well, by that point he's not really a tyrant, he's a monarch. He's become a monarch. Then his sons, of course, did oppress, according to Thucydides, Herodotus, and so on, did oppress the Athenian demos, or did target enemies and so forth. Therefore, they are tyrants again. So, in a sense, it's a very tricky concept for that reason. But I think the origins of tyranny in the people's desire to reduce internal civil conflict, I think, would be the place to look. That's how I would understand it. Yeah.
Thank you. I had the same question when I took the challenge to contribute here, because I was wondering when the tyrant is thought of as a tyrant. So I guess in our sense, exactly. And it makes, I guess, a huge difference when you talk about tyranny from a democratic perspective, and when is it that democracy thinks of itself as democracy in a positive. And these are long, I mean, you obviously know this better than I do. The terms and the meanings that we have were not there. So I guess that would be a different paper, but a very interesting one when these terms became what we think of that they mean. But what I wanted to add, which is a comment on my contribution, is that from the philosophers thought of Pisistratus, I mean, there is this reference to the age of Kronos, and Aristotle says that, I think, that people had, and those of us who are Greek here, and take taxes, I don't want to be racist, but every now and then they will say, well, in the junta, everything was so safe. So you have the same kind of huge anachronism, but what Plato says about it is that, let's say that you had everything. Did you become engaged in thinking? Did you do philosophy, or were you just taking it for granted? And is the age of Kronos something that is part of human nature, that it pertains to human nature or not? So I guess that's an old question also.
Let me just say one last thing on this point. Because it is true that people will often say that the word tyrannos originally meant simply a single ruler. And in my own study of that concept, I don't quite agree with that, because usually when somebody calls another person a tyrant, as in that passage from Alcaeus that I quoted, he's calling Pittacus a tyrannos. Well, he's doing that to denigrate him. He's not doing it just to say, oh, he's a single ruler. He's doing it to say he's a tyrant, and others would disagree. But it's, at the same time, it's unquestionably true that the definitively negative interpretation of single rulers as tyrants came about in the Athenian democracy with the tyrannicides, because the democracy, for ideological reasons, opposed itself to tyranny. And then Plato gave his inimitable psychological stamp to that picture in further explaining why it's so horrible and negative.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, and then I'll invite you all for a glass of wine.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was a very an excellent setup of three perspectives. And among my many possible questions, I want to pursue this possible relationship between talk of fear and talk of resentment or ressentiment. Because I think if we just look at this Callicles episode in the Gorgias, he seems to have both in spades, I think. I mean, he's got the fear driving him. I think, you know, it's not a crazy interpretation to say that that's happening. But I think he also, I mean, Ryan, you also pointed out that the way that he talks about justice and injustice seems to be a sort of school paradigmatic example of some kind of resentment towards other people. So I was wondering if, you know, either one of you would care to speculate on the connection between those two emotions, because they seem to share a lot. I mean, for one thing, they're not basic and simple. They are both reflective, because they're not just about others. They're about yourself and your own worth in relation to others, or the, you know, the risk of losing your own existence or something. So they seem to be like cousins in a way. But you know, would anyone venture to say more about it? And by the way, it's really interesting that we have all these political theories today, but once we get into the kind of difficulties that we are today, we start speculating on the individual psychology of leaders, and then we go back to the ancients.
Thank you very much for this question. Definitely, I agree with you. Ressentiment has fear inside. Fear is the first step towards ressentiment, because actually people need to fear this. Either they have experienced the loss, or the fear of losing their social status, things that belong to them, or what they feel should belong to them. So ressentiment has inside fear, but it has also moral anger. So I want to take revenge because I have lost my identity, I have lost my belongings, I have lost my status. So they're definitely connected, and this is what I tried also to show, that this is not a different story. Fear is part of ressentiment, and it is an indispensable ingredient of it. And what we have seen in those focus groups, which were very, very interesting, is that people started by their fear. This is the first thing that they mentioned in the focus groups is fear of what is happening. And by the way, according to most of those people that not most of them, but many of them, said that Greece is no longer a democracy. So they didn't feel that they lived in a democratic regime during the financial crisis, at least. And then this need to take revenge of what is happening to us. So this is where the sentiment comes in. But yes, I see the connection definitely.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that question. I think this is one of the key issues of our discussion today, and it's really such a pleasure and enlightening to be up here talking with Professor Rory on this topic, because we come at it from such different perspectives. The way that I was understanding it in the Platonic text, anyway, leave aside, you know, all of the 20th century and all of that, was to say that the Socratic cross-examination of Callicles uncovered that at the heart of it all, or at the root of it all, is fear, and that a moralized hostility toward others served as a kind of cover for and an explanation of something that was more primal. And then that this desire for revenge to me, at least in this text, let's say, is further downstream because it leads to action. And this is, I think there's a lot more to discuss here, in fact. I mean, I know we don't have time for it right now, but just in life, whether that moralized anger, as I was suggesting, mediates between fear and action in the world, and is the source of driving a person to, you know, build on his fears, let's say, to act or not, whether there is a more tentacular kind of relationship, which is not explained hierarchically the way that I was talking about it. So anyway, I mean, this is to me the key issue here. Yeah.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I have to take one last question. I fear my Canadian embassy colleagues here, so I'll let them.
I'm sorry to be the last obstacle before the apéro, but I was wondering quickly if you could speak a little bit about the concept of damnatio memoriae in the cancel culture of more used in ancient Rome, but used to react against to forget the tyrant, which is the opposite of the education to prevent the emergence of tyranny. How that concept would be carved into your reflection on tyranny?
Well, I will take a stab at that one as well. Maybe colleagues can chime in, but I think that's a very interesting question because it gets back to the question, of course, about commemoration and forgetting. And on the one hand, damnatio memoriae is a kind of post hoc punishment of a tyrant who wants to be remembered as a founder or as a leader and benefactor. It becomes therefore a kind of prospective warning, and the Athenians used it this way as well, along with other forms of political education, both of aspiring tyrants but also of citizens. For example, the decree of Demophantus in 410 BC. Basically ordering all citizens to rise up and take personal responsibility if a tyrant begins to emerge, and freeing them from any potential consequences for fighting against or even killing a tyrant, encouraging all Athenians to be tyrannicides. So I suppose that I see damnatio memoriae operating along with various other kinds of social institutions and so on, to educate citizens and aspiring tyrants into a kind of democratic mindset. That's how I look at it. The question of historical memory in this context is extremely interesting, I think.
I'm not very into this discussion, but what I wanted just to say is that what we see from surveys is that the younger generation in many Western democracies who have forgotten of the past or haven't lived a dictatorial past, they're the ones who are more prone to anti-democratic stances and attitudes. So I don't know how this might relate, but from the empirical point of view, people who either don't have any experience of a tyranny or a dictatorship or a monarchy, or those who have forgotten. So when the memory fades away, this is where anti-democratic politics find room in order to flourish.
I don't think I have anything to add here, but if I have 1 minute, I was thinking that resentment also is part of the Callicles story insofar as nomoi, in that context, laws are being treated with skepticism in the crisis of the democracy. So there is room, there is space for them to say, like you said, who cares about the laws? Look what you're doing with them. You just vote for whatever you want, and this is all fraud. And it's time to tell the truth. And then what Plato does is, I think, he shows how threatening that is as a standpoint. So he's on your side.
Well, good. Professor Bala, Professor Rory, Professor Balot, thank you so very much for this extremely interesting meeting. And all of you, please join us for a glass of wine and a bit of a meze, and we can continue our discussions. Thank you all so much.